Hi, guys. Before we begin the episode, I want to tell you about an amazing website that could help you get your health back. I know that sounds like a big statement to make, and I know a lot of you out there have been concerned about your health. There's a website that could change your life and potentially even save your life. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Just please go on there, watch the videos, sign up to watch the videos, and learn how you could get your health back to the way it was prior to COVID and even better. All right, welcome to the latest episode of Blood Money. Today, we have a very special guest. We're not going to give this gentleman's name. This is going to be held in complete secrecy because this individual is going to expose how the Chinese are using lawfare to essentially infiltrate our system, how this is one of the key components of their plans to harm and or destroy our country. So, sir, first, could you give us any information you're comfortable giving about yourself and setting up the information you're about to expose?
Sure. Well, I'm a lawyer here in the United States, and as you might appreciate, when we come across certain matters, certain cases, certain people, things really start to trouble you. And it sits certain things sit very uncomfortably with me. And this really started when one started looking at a series of cases, not that I'm directly involved with them at all, but as you know, we all go down rabbit holes and we all start looking and seeing. And I wondered as to what extent the certain arms of state-owned entities and Chinese governmental entities, why certain cases were being prosecuted or taken in the way that they were. And one of them that really struck me was this case of Northeast Securities. And Northeast Securities was going out of its way to try and use the American courts and certainly the courts in California, to try and enforce judgments that they have against mixed either Chinese or Chinese-American individuals in the United States. And it's sometimes concerning assets that are allegedly there in China against people that at a certain point they had Chinese jurisdiction over, but yet they're litigating these cases in the United States. And it didn't sit well with me, because why are they doing it over there in China?
So what you're saying is these are cases that should really be fought in China, but for some reason they're being fought in the United States.
Yeah, well, yes. And I think I know the reason is this. There are certain laws, not necessarily in China, but more in Hong Kong, that would preclude them taking those cases forward in Hong Kong, but yet they can do so in the United States using United States laws, United States jurisdiction, especially when it comes to what they call the Uniform Fraudulent Transfers Act. And then they can then take a judgment from the United States, potentially, and go back to China with it, and then rehabilitate it there.
Okay, so it seems as though that is a technique of, and tell me if I'm incorrect here because I'm a bit of a layman when it comes to these particular matters. It seems as though they're basically trying to use the freedoms we have in the United States that they don't have in China against us.
Well, not just against us, but sometimes against American citizens. Because there are certain people who are dual citizens, they're both American and Chinese, and they're using them against American citizens as well. You see, one of the very interesting things is with multi-jurisdictional law, which is this. If I get a judgment in the United States as against a Chinese entity, and I want to go and force that over in the United States, in China, I apologize, it is nearly impossible to do so.
Wow.
China make it so very difficult to enforce American judgments in the United States. I've had countless of them. And what they make you do is they make you first have everything translated into Chinese. And with that, you have to go to the Chinese embassy or the Chinese consulate in New York. And you have to get every page translated into Chinese. And for that, you have to pay. And you have to pay the Chinese consulate or the Chinese embassy to do that. And if you go nearly any day in New York, for example, to the Chinese consulate, you'll see there is a line out of the door, and half of that is lawyers or people representing Americans trying to get their documents certified and translated into Chinese before you ever get it into the Chinese court. Once you get it into the Chinese court, it gets sent back. It can take sometimes years, to the point that unless your client has very, very deep pockets, if let's say you're a mom and pop store in the United States and you got screwed over by a Chinese manufacturer because they've not delivered, they've failed to deliver, they've taken your money, there is no way, realistically, you can enforce an American judgment in China. Nearly impossible.
The inverse, I mean, how do we treat them?
Oh, it's quite remarkable. The inverse is, if you come to the United States with a Chinese judgment, and it's translated, all you need is the translation, the judgment itself translated into English. An American court takes it, says thank you very much, it looks like a fairly proper Chinese judgment, it gets stamped and it gets enforced against a United States citizen. There are known as principles of comity, where you have to, and through treaties, recognize the other person's judgment. That's fine. But if you're an American trying to enforce against China, nearly impossible. If you're Chinese looking to enforce against an American, dead easy.
I mean, that's almost, I mean, that's kind of, there's a little bit of racism there, I would say, in the mentality of, the reciprocity. Is that what it is? I'm saying the wrong.
Yeah. You're sure you're saying exactly right. It's reciprocity.
There you go, okay.
No, whereas the Chinese courts and the Chinese system protects the Chinese citizen, the American courts and the American system just lays themselves wide open, legs spread, so to speak, and I'm sorry to be crude, and say, come and take us, come and take whatever you like over here.
Yeah.
It's just not treated. It's just not treated in the same way. And now, in the ideal world, there would be perfect reciprocity. That the Chinese would make it very easy, as I say, for the mom and pop in America to go over to the other side. But there is a whole industry here. Not only do we have to pay the Chinese government for all the translations and all the filing fees, then once you do that, you can never get it rehabilitated, or there's no reciprocity over there. Now, to make it even worse, there are lawyers over here in the United States, barred in the United States, making fortunes going against American companies on behalf of state-owned entities in China.
Okay, let me just get some clarification here. You're talking about American lawyers, and I think have to make a distinction here. So you're talking about American lawyers fighting on the behalf of the Chinese. Are these Americans of Chinese descent, or are we talking about just rank and file American lawyers that are basically working on behalf of the Chinese?
No, some of them are the rank and file, but there are some who are Chinese. Sometimes Chinese or Chinese Americans, and they've gone and trained and lectured over there in Chinese universities, and are very much part of the Chinese legal establishment, which is a very closed shop, and are now part of law firms that have either set up themselves or they've purchased in the United States, and are acting realistically as foreign legal agents of the of the Chinese government.
Wow. So okay, I need a little bit more clarification here. So you're a lawyer.
Sure. Yes.
It sounds like there's a little bit of, and I don't want to use big words, but it sounds like if you're working against the interests of your country on behalf of a foreign entity that actually has radically different political beliefs, radically different views on freedom, that would seem that it's a tad bit treasonous, no?
It's certainly subversive, however you want to call it that. But we have rules that if you are acting as what would be a foreign agent, then you should be registering yourself as a foreign agent.
Mm.
It's certainly nearly every lawyer when they are sworn in to be a lawyer in nearly any jurisdiction that I know, they have to swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States and uphold the Constitution of your local states.
Mm-hmm.
Here, one would hope that those lawyers are not acting on behalf of another government as against United States citizens when they have very close ties to that establishment. It is, it is insidious at its very core. There have been lawyers that one can pinpoint and say, how did that lawyer, why are they acting nearly exclusively on behalf of state-owned entities, nearly exclusively seeking to enforce judgments against American citizens, and when it goes back the other way, if you were to go hypothetically to that same lawyer and say, I want to enforce something over in China against a state-owned entity, they would never take the case.
From somebody looking at this situation from the outside, right? You're looking at a country which seems to be having so much freedoms that's being abused, right? It seems as though the watchmen and the watchwomen that are supposed to, play referee and make sure that things are equal and fair are nowhere in sight. It would seem as though through our quote unquote, liberalism in terms of our legal practices, things are happening that don't seem quite fair, balanced, and I would dare to say lawful. I mean, could you confirm, deny, explain, I guess from a lawyer's point of view, the statements that I just made?
Well, from a lawyer's point of view, the problem is we've set up the law to allow for that. So, for example, we do have reciprocity. We do have reciprocity with other countries. There are certain countries we don't have reciprocity with because we recognize that their legal system is unfair. But in so doing, we don't take into account, especially within the United States, whether or not that country to whom we are giving reciprocity treats our citizens fairly in turn. It should be a free-flowing system whereby you enforce my judgments and I will enforce your judgments. Here, the problem is that it is a one-way street. Chinese state-owned entities have rights within the United States to enforce their judgments, whereas American citizens have absolutely zero rights to enforce their interests in in China. Absolutely none. And so money is very much flowing one way and one way only. You have a debt owed to you by a Chinese entity or state-owned entity, you will never get recovery over that, or nearly never get recovery over that. And judges, when they see a judgment coming over from China here, because of the way that it's been set up, they say, not a problem. Let's just enforce that. You can have your judgment. Very little issues, and the mom and pop, or even the larger company over here in the United States, has absolutely no protection from the courts. Now, sometimes those judgments are concerning assets in China, where, as I said, especially in Hong Kong, The law in Hong Kong, so let's say, I'm going to break it down for you legally. You get a judgment against a person in Hong Kong for, let's say, doing a bad business deal. They owe somebody a debt, but they also have a home which a few years prior they transferred to a child. Now, in China, in order to prove that was a fraudulent transfer is very, very, very difficult. And on the whole, the Chinese courts would not allow the Chinese state-owned entity to get hold of those assets in China. However, that Chinese state-owned entity can come over to the United States and say, hey, there are these assets over there in China. We believe it was a fraudulent transfer. The California courts will say, yes, that was a fraudulent transfer. Give the person a judgment. They can then take it back to China and they can enforce it against those assets. In fact, the Chinese plaintiff has more protection from the American courts over Chinese assets than they would have back in China.
Wow.
If they bring it before the American courts. It is spaghetti-like and makes no sense.
I mean, for people listening out there, they're watching the persecution of Donald Trump. They're seeing how, for example, the New York judgment based upon these accusations that our former president, I guess, sexually assaulted somebody 30 years ago, which there's not even a shred of evidence, $80-something million judgment. Then we have the $400-something million judgment. From somebody watching that doesn't understand law, it seems as though our practice of law in general within this country has gone a little haywire. How do you react to those statements as a lawyer?
It's become highly, highly politicized, highly weaponized, and highly charged. As somebody, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle somebody may sit on, and somebody looks at some of those cases from the external perspective and says, how can it be that millions upon millions of dollars that could be, and sometimes billions, but no, let's call it tens of millions of dollars, are being used by prosecutors or attorney generals who are being paid for by the state, especially in a state like New York, which is broke most of the time, and being weaponized to go and chase after somebody where there was absolutely zero complaints. It makes no sense. The legal systems at the moment, it makes no sense. And maybe it's because people are trying to make their name. And this is a way that they can make their name and be seen as big within their parties. But it's we, the taxpayer, that's paying out and shelling out for this monumental waste of time.
It would seem as though from the outside that all these hundreds of millions that are being spent on these unjust persecutions, I mean, it seems as though there's money to be spent on fixing our legal system. And you look at that same kind of method of thinking. For example, I was just in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia looks like something out of a Mad Max movie, right? Potholes, it's pretty much unlivable, crazy people walking down the streets, just a complete shithole. Then we have hundreds of millions being spent on foreign wars, billions, sorry, and then I hear that our law institutions are an absolute mess. Seems like that would be a good place to invest all this money. How do you react to those statements?
You have to start from home, don't you? And you have to understand, or not just start from home, you've got to wonder where people's priorities really lie. Is it to make the person on the street their lives better? Let me give you a prime example. It happened about a year and a half ago. I don't know if you remember when the gas prices were very, very high.
Yes.
And I stopped at the petrol station. I was filling my car, and I see a lady, a black lady, and she was filling up the car, and she was dripping in. You could see her counting the cents, and she gets to $7.50. I think, I can't see this. I go there, I put in my credit card into her gas pump, and I say fill up. And the woman looks at me, and she, tears came to her eyes, tears came to my eyes, to be perfectly frank. In today's day and age, I should not be having to do that for this lady, and she should not be having to feel this way. To look upon the charity of a stranger, for just to be able to fill up her car to go to work or whatever she's doing. There are major problems here at home. Major problems here at home that are not served by many of these prosecutions and many of these legal cases. One questions the motivations of why they've been brought, of what personal benefit are certain people taking out of that. In the same regard, why are Chinese companies being given free rein within the United States? Why are certain lawyers being given free rein within the United States to execute judgments on behalf of Chinese companies? Where is the motivation for that? And who's benefiting from that?
Okay, so let's say in the U.S. courts there was a judgment. I know you've clearly stated how it is very hard to enforce our judgments from the United States in China, right? Let's say there's a judgment having to do with Europe, the United Kingdom, or France within UK courts. How would that be treated differently in terms of how the UK would see a U.S. judgment versus how the Chinese would see a U.S. judgment?
Oh, the UK judge is very, very easy. In the UK, you take your US judgment. There's one called, other than libel judgments, we can set that to one side for a second. But nearly every other judgment, you go to the UK, they look at it, it's deemed to be enforceable, it'll be enforced. Same thing in France, same thing in Spain. It's very easy to get everything enforced across those. There is reciprocity.
I mean, it just sounds like, how would we even allow something like this? It just sounds bizarre that our entire political establishment knows very well that, you know what, at least the Europeans would respect our judgment. They treat us on equal footing, right? But the Chinese aren't doing that. I mean, that would seem like a code red moment for our politicians in order to put regulations in place to prevent that kind of unequal behavior.
Correct. You would think that, but the question is, why haven't they? What benefit? It may be because of the debt burden is, the burgeoning debt burden is so large that if they were to do that, China would hypothetically close down the pipeline of the spigot as to any monies and might recourse certain debt. It might well be that certain politicians, it's just not in their interest to have American interests being properly enforced over there in the United States, over there in China. I mean, it makes no sense.
Let me bring up something here. I was very early on. This was actually like 20-something years ago in Los Angeles. I realized that essentially the Saudi princes, the children of the Saudi princes that would show up to nightclubs and after-hours clubs and Lamborghinis and, just a lot of wealth. We're talking about, individuals that have hundreds of millions of dollars that are the sons of these Saudi princes, pretty much had free reign and more or less diplomatic immunity in Los Angeles. So even when I saw very specific crimes being committed before my eyes, literally the LAPD would let them go, right? So I started to inquire why that was, and I learned that Saudi Arabia has essentially holds so much U.S. dollar that we have to give them this kind of special treatment, because if they sell off all their U.S. dollars, and this was 20-something years ago, then it would cause harm to our economy. I mean, this seems like you tell me what you think about those statements that I just made, but my reading of that situation is that these people that are getting special treatment within our country because they're holding U.S. dollars is a horrible, horrible way to approach things.
Yes, it is. America is very much a place where the dollar is king. That's part of what makes America great. That anybody can make it, and anybody can be big. But on the other side, there is also a huge amount of endemic and systemic corruption that has gone on. You know, we see for example, with the whole Hunter Biden scandal, which, you know, one can only scratch the surface and wonders why. Why would anybody have ever gone into business with Hunter Biden? It's obvious for all to see. It's because he was providing access to key decision makers. One of them may well have been his father. Why would you know, if you were to do due diligence on the man, there would be no reason why you'd ever want to be in business with him. However, he managed to get himself and his family members massive payouts through Chinese companies. There is something where we have turned a blind eye to what is clearly evident to everybody else around the rest of the world. If you go to, let's say, France, and say, what do you think Hunter Biden was selling favors? Everybody would go, yeah, of course. It's only the Americans that say, well, no, that can't possibly be right, could it?
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about the debt of the U.S.A. It seems as though this idea of actually bankrupting this nation and having a monetary system that's actually backed by something in this day and age where BRICS is taking off, seems like as painful of a decision as that would be to bankrupt this country and change the essence of our monetary system to actually be backed by whether it's precious metals, land, other resources, is the only decision that we could make at this point. What is your reactions to that comment?
So, well, I'm certainly not an economist, but one does have to question the spending policy of the United States, especially at the moment. You know, just so you're aware that nearly any other country doesn't have, you know, when we have the government shutdowns and we talk about the debt ceiling and are they going to agree with the debt ceiling, etc. No other government in the world that I'm aware of actually has this problem, where actually people can just freeze government in its tracks because they can't agree what a budget would be, because it's just gone so wildly out of control. And it really is wildly out of control. But yet, there's been an inordinate amount of money that's been spent, especially in central Washington, on, you know, especially over the last few years, on trials and impeachments, etc., etc. An inordinate amount of money, when the majority of hard-working Americans, all they want is for the government to get on and do its job. Get on and do its job. And then we have the amount of police monies that are being spent on patrolling rioters on the streets at the moment. What's gone on in New York over the past 6 months, especially since October the 7th, with marauding mobs, is just the way that local government and certain regard central government sees it. Money is just a bottomless pit and it's there to be spent.
Having studied negotiable instruments, promissory notes, securities, and if you actually dive into what are these things that are called, you know, Federal Reserve notes, what is a bank note, what is a negotiable instrument, what is a security, it's actually kind of scary diving into that topic, because you realize that not only is it like based upon nothing. You know, people use that terminology, house of cards, and my terminology would be, or my explanation of what I've discovered in studying these policies, is that it's almost like you build a house of cards, right? And it's so perfectly like built, and it's like that kind of like 0.1 percentile of perfection that you could actually lay a baby cow on top of it, right? But if that baby cow decides they're going to move even a smidget, the house of cards falls. And that's what our monetary system is, because it's backed by nothing. It's beyond the Ponzi scheme. It's literally the creation of money out of nothing, which would seem as though that's a bad way to move forward and a bad way to create something like 35 trillion in debt or whatever we're at right now. People say it's more like, if you take the digital debt as well, we're talking more in the hundreds of trillions, not actually 35, 40 trillion. I mean, what's your understanding of the topic in terms of how our money's created and what it's backed by?
One of these things, you might as well be looking at monopoly figures at the moment. The amount of trillions that are out there in terms of what is deemed to be debt. I'm not ever sure that that is ever recoverable, ever in the situation where there could be payoff, ever in the situation, unless we're just beholden to other countries' interests. Because it's not as if we're in debt to our own country. It's not as if we're in debt to Americans. It must be the case that if we're in debt to other countries, and yet nobody else pays the United States for the privilege of keeping the world safe, keeping the shipping lanes open, keeping the air, the skies open, and trying to keep the majority of the world free, and yet there is burgeoning interest which must come with some Faustian pact. There must be some deal with the devil that has been done, and that if America tried to push it too far, the people who hold those notes, who hold that debt, would just say no. And we've got ourselves into this position.
Sorry, that sounds like a hostage situation. When you said that, I mean, I suddenly had this image of, those classic hostage videos where there's four or five guys with AK-47 standing in front of somebody that's sitting with a blindfold on. I mean, that seems to be America right now.
Very much so. And the further that we push ourselves into this, the further we are making ourselves hostage to other parties' interests. Like, tell me something. Could you ever see and envisage a situation where America could work towards, despite being the greatest economy on this earth, could you ever see us working towards a position whereby America is minimizing and bringing it down its debt burden? And if we can't envisage that, and if we can't strategize that, we're going the wrong way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing that we've been saying on the America Happens Network, because we are very well studied in these topics of negotiable instruments, what we call, quote unquote money, which is not really money. Gold and silver is money, but what we've come to learn to call money, which is this currency that is backed by absolutely nothing except for military power, right? And also, we're in this hostage situation, whether it's the Saudis or the Chinese, anybody that holds great amounts of our quote unquote negotiable instruments that could then hold a gun to America's head and say, hey, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, then we're going to sell your negotiable instruments. All of a sudden, you have a country that is based on certain constitutional principles that is having to compromise those constitutional principles because of what is essentially a Federal Reserve. That was something that was set up in the hurry to essentially finance World War I. So it's a kind of a domino effect of these mistakes after mistake after mistake, bad policies that seem to have led us to this juncture where now we're allowing lawfare within our country, which is a topic that I would love to dive into a little bit more in terms of the tangible things that are happening. If you could name names of people that are involved in this lawfare, involved in this law, what law firms, and tell us a little bit about that topic of what the tangible lawfare on a daily basis looks like and who is involved.
So certainly there's one law firm that I have managed to cover in relation to this, which is one based out of New York, and it's got a name that seems very vanilla and plain, which is GGW Kramer LLP. But then when you look down, the managing partner is a chap called Rong Ping Wu. And Rong Ping Wu, nearly all of his practice focuses on cross-border litigation and judgment enforcement and asset recovery on behalf of Chinese state-owned entities and Chinese high-level litigants. Now, when I looked into his background, he styles himself as an adjunct law professor with the Southwest University of Political Science and Law. Again, Southwest University Political Science and Law sounds very vanilla, and it's where he got his LLB, his original law degree, and his LLM, which is Law Masters. But then you realize that this Southwest University of Political Science and Law isn't in the southwest of America. It's in China.
Oh, wow.
And it's where nearly all of the high-level appellate judges and nearly all of the politicians who are sitting there very up on high have gone to themselves. Here is a lawyer practicing within the United States who has a degree, practiced very well marinated into the highest echelons of Chinese political and legal society, and yet is in the United States as a managing partner and bringing cases nearly routinely against American citizens, American interests, in order to enforce what he called Chinese judgments that have been obtained over there in China.
Wow.
And sometimes it's against those people who are dual citizens, and sometimes it's against people who are citizens of the United States, or sometimes it's against Chinese people who have fled China to the United States. And so when they fled an oppressive regime to the United States, looking for, this was a whole principle of the building of the United States, where people could come and be shielded from the oppression of those regimes abroad. We in the United States are laying our doors open and saying, by all means, carry on your oppression here, because you can come and use the American laws against these Americans, against these people we are ostensibly shielding, and just carry on doing what you were doing previously. We know what happens to people in China that step out of favor with the people up on high. And this was one particular individual that I started looking into the cases that he was taking, and certainly what type of cases and against whom he is taking these cases. And nearly exclusively, and nearly always, he will put in affidavits in those cases attesting to the propriety of the Chinese proceedings that had gone by in the past.
So I'm imagining these lawyers in these law firms, right? And in a better day in this country, these actual lawyers that are seeing this happen, this infiltration, this lawfare, would, in better days, be like, wait a minute, these are anti-American things you're doing. And they would self-police their own law firms. They would call these people out. But this sort of thing doesn't happen without the support of the other people in the law firm, right? And then at the same time, you have this media apparatus that's constantly telling us that America's evil and trying to drive us towards socialism, or at least that's what it seems like to my eyes and ears. How much of an effect this kind of self-loathing that's created by the media gives individuals that are seeing this kind of corruption, anti-American behavior happen? And I'm talking about the lawyers surrounded by, by this particular lawyer that you just spoke about. How much of an effect has that had on people closing their eyes and allowing this sort of lawfare destruction to happen within our country?
It's a huge effect. And we have to remember, this has been going on not just for 10 years, but 20 years and 30 years. There are, one goes now to law schools within the United States, and we've seen this over the past God knows how many years, and we're starting to see now where, in fact, funding within universities and law schools come from, right? And a lot of it is coming from external interests who are paying for professorial seats to teach certain aspects. When I was looking at, for example, Albany Law School, there was a professor there who teaches American imperialism from a critical perspective. Now one has to ask the question, what in God's name has American imperialism got to do with teaching law in a law school? It's got nothing to do with contract, nothing to do with equities, nothing to do with trust. But there has been what seems to be a distinct pattern over the last 30 years to erode what could deem to be the core values of what it means to be an American. Lawfare has started not in the courts, but it started in the law schools. When you've gone to places like Berkeley, as a prime example, where one has seen law being used as a tool of oppression of certain students who step out of line or who are deemed to have non-Berkeley views. So, like as a prime example, there are organizations at Berkeley Law School that 2 years ago voted in that any person who is a Zionist isn't allowed to speak within their organizations, even if they're not speaking on anything to do with Zionism. If they hold beliefs that are Zionist, they shouldn't be allowed to come and lecture them on certain aspects of law. That happens in Berkeley. And that has gone not just unchecked, but that has been actively promoted within the law school. The same thing is if people were to stand up for what might be deemed to be, nowadays are deemed to be traditional conservative values, but they're actually really just common sense viewpoints. That America is a good place to be, America upholds democracy, people should have basic rights, people should be allowed to think and speak in the way that they wish to, that there are no major taboos out there. But then you have to understand, certainly when it comes to freedom of speech, as a prime example, certainly when it comes to freedom of speech, that is very much a one-way ticket. That's very much a one-way ticket in the United States. As long as you are saying what the other people want you to hear. So when it goes back to that central question that you were speaking about, which is why do lawyers allow this to happen? I think they're scared. I think they're scared to poke their head above the parapet. I think they're scared to bring light to the fact of what's going on. I think they're scared to be the unpopular person in the room. And I think many people, because this has happened by stealth, just see it as the norm. If I go into court today or tomorrow and say, hey, a Chinese judgment shouldn't be enforced because there's no reciprocity between the United States and China, a judge would laugh at me.
Is there anything else in terms of this particular topic? And I know you named some names in terms of firms and individuals. Is there any more information you have to give before we conclude this interview?
Not really. I think that I think this is something that I would like to see the legislature have close scrutiny of, and I think that they should start looking at those certain individuals who seem to be acting not for American interests, but rather for the interests of third-party countries, and especially look into where the interests realistically are aligned. That's the worry that we have. Judges should be live to it. Lawyers should be live to it. And the legislature needs to start being live to it.
Yeah. This brings me just, in closing, I want to mention something because I do think this particular topic would be helpful for you to be aware, for the viewers to be aware. And as this episode, which I believe is going to be an incredible episode, I mean, this is information, and I thank you for being willing to come out and speak about this topic that is so crucial for the future of this country. It would seem as though this lawfare that's happening the component that seems to be missing in this overall makeup of things is what I call Project Veritas in Congress, right? Which is one of our agendas to take this kind of information and put it in front of congressional members, right? Because as the America Happens Network, we were actually in Congress for about 3 weeks in the month of February, March. And what you see there is you see a lot of these mainstream media outlets that are always in the room, right? And as we know, these mainstream media outlets, quote unquote Hollywood, is very much with selling this propaganda being part of the problem, right? And so one of the things we thought about is we need essentially what we're calling Project Veritas in Congress, which is getting these topics in front of congressional members and putting pressure on them via having an independent media presence that seems very crucial to this. I mean, do you think that is part of the solution of having more boots on the ground in Washington, D.C., with cameras in the faces of these politicians, bringing these issues forward so we're constantly pressing them on the topic?
100%. You see, what your role here is it's remarkably important. We need to keep people on track in Congress. We need to keep people focused on what they should be doing rather than what they should not be doing, which is going on rabid witch hunts against people and trying to create revisionist history. There are problems that are going on at the moment on the ground which are affecting United States citizens and United States interests. And what you're doing by having those cameras in their faces is remarkably important. It keeps people true. You know, you don't have what they have over in Britain, for example, which are prime ministers' question times every week. Without that, what you're doing is of crucial importance.
I really thank you for that, because it's, we had this revelation while in Congress 3 weeks ago, and that's what came forward. I mean, I was working with some individuals that are working on the Military Accountability Project, and this idea of Project Veritas in Congress seemed like the thing that was missing. And for the viewers out there, we have set up a fundraising mechanism where our goal is to get 10 correspondents per month flooding Congress. And from the amounts of monies we've heard spent on other things that literally lead nowhere, millions spent on political campaigns, it would seem as though getting 10 correspondents in Congress, which is a drop in the bucket, would result in a lot more action in terms of putting pressure on these individuals. Because my 2 cents is, I'm from Hollywood. I grew up in Hollywood. I was a Hollywood TV producer, a music video director, and what I realized is that Hollywood and Washington, D.C. are very similar in that you have what I call performers performing to an audience, right? And when your audience is all mainstream media that's going along with the narrative that's destructive to our country, they are performing to that audience. What happens if you insert 10 voices, 10 correspondents that are not following that narrative, that are actually asking the hard questions? All of a sudden, which I saw one correspondent that was in Congress 5 days a week, and I could see how once this correspondent walked into the room, the tone would change, and all of a sudden, these politicians would get nervous because they didn't have the mainstream media cover. And so I started thinking, hey, let's put 10 of these people in here, and that's part of our agenda, And in closing, I just want to mention that because we truly feel as though that is the missing link to actually getting things moving in the right direction.
It's keeping people honest. You're doing a magnificent job. And the more that you can do, the better this country will be.
Wow. That's all we strive to do, sir. Thank you so much for coming on to the Blood Money podcast. This is a very exciting episode. Thank you for having the courage to expose this. It's because of people like you that this information is going to get out there. And it's because of people like you that we're going to save this country. And that must happen, because the other option is going into some kind of Chinese communism, and having had parents that escaped that kind of tyranny, that is not a viable option.
All right, guys, for this episode
episode, I wanted to do a little after blood money closing bit. We heard about how this whistleblower is talking about how our courts are also being invaded by foreign interests, right? But where is Congress? Where is our congressional members? This is why at the America Happens Network, we feel that it's important to get what we call Project Veritas in Congress. That means independent journalists from the America Happens Network flooding the halls of Congress, asking these congressional members the hard questions that they never get asked, right? You have an audience of mainstream media members that are not asking the hard questions like, hey, why is our U.S. courts being invaded by the Chinese? Why are the Chinese allowed to do this in our country while we can't do the same in China? And there's many questions like this. For example, the J6 individuals that are clearly feds that have yet to be exposed by Congress that show that it was a Fedsurrection and not an insurrection, right? So there's a lot of these hard questions that the mainstream media is not asking, and there is no independent media in the halls of Congress, like you see the mainstream media flooding the halls of Congress. So that is part of our new agenda at the America Happens Network to start what we call Project Veritas in Congress. So please consider donating to us. Links below, links on the screen right here, and help us get our correspondents into Congress asking the hard questions on a daily level so we could hold our politicians accountable and more than anything else, put their feet to the fire so they are paying attention to these issues that unfortunately the mainstream media ignores because as we know, the mainstream media is part of this narrative essentially to make our country into a socialist country, to steal the rights of Americans, to give foreigners higher privileges than America's own citizens. And this could not go on. And the way we battle this is by having our correspondents in Congress, what we're calling Project Veritas in Congress. Please support, and I will see you on the next episode of Blood Money.